So I've been working on my custom bokeh camera rig for a couple days now, and I'm really proud to announce that I'm publicly releasing it free for download by everyone. Available to download in my Discord server, link down below. Just join the assets channel and you can find it and download it from there. Now I'm really excited for some of y'all to start using this because this camera setup is unlike anything you can find out there. First of all, if you've ever tried rendering custom bokeh in Blender before, the only real way to do it is by using a plane, adding a texture on it, or you can even do it through geometry, and then place it really close to the camera, enable depth of field, and then the bokeh shapes will appear the same as your texture that you have applied on your plane. This is how most people's setup would look like, a plane right in front of the camera, and it has a texture on it, which I have my own custom bokeh texture on it. And that is really it. And now you get your custom bokeh shape being rendered out, as opposed to if I hide this plane, you just get a normal circle. And for the most part, it worked. It's easy to set up and it looks great. However, watch what happens if I change any of the camera parameters here. Let's say I want a tighter angle shot, 10 millimeters. Whoops, guess what happened? The plane no longer have the proper alignment to produce that effect on the camera no more. And you gotta manually like push it inwards or something. Actually, I'm not even sure how to do this. Might need a skill, yeah. Sometimes you don't even know if you're doing it properly. It's just guesswork. And there you go, I guess problem solved. But okay, what if I want to make the shot even more blurry, because now that I've decreased the focal length, there's less bokeh now. So let's give it a lower aperture, shall we? 0.2. And oh, what happened? So yeah, you probably get the point already. This setup is extremely janky. It's great for still renders if you have your focal length and aperture set. But if you're rendering out an animation and animating these parameters here, it's pretty much impossible to get consistent results. Not to mention the amount of tedious work you have to do moving the camera, like enlarging it or moving it forward or backward. So my custom bokeh camera setup aims to solve that completely, and I think it does that perfectly. It honestly, I've done a lot of testing and it appears to be extremely functional, reliable, consistent, and most importantly, it gives you all the control you would ever need. Aberration, bokeh cutoff, all of these different things. I will explain everything and how to use them in this video. And yeah, to prove that this is actually really consistent right here, if I go to rendered view, let's change the focal length and see. Yeah, you can totally see changing it back and forth. There is no darkening. There is nothing. You can't see the iris appearing. And let's change the aperture. Let's see. Bring it down. None of that problems. No darkening effect. Nothing. It's completely consistent. This setup is designed for animations. In the future, I would also be using this. And I thought it would be great to release it for everyone to use it. And also, come to think of it, there's an add-on out there called ProLens add-on that essentially does the same thing, but it's a lot more janky and has all the problems that I mentioned earlier. I'm not exactly sure how the creator of that add-on would feel about me releasing this to the public. There's probably no reason to download that add-on no more, and it costs money some more. Anyway, without further ado, I'm gonna show you what each and every one of these parameters do. So first up, we got hollow. Now, basically, this is just like this is basically the fill of the bokeh. So these two parameters is controlling the look of the bokeh procedurally. So if I bring a hollow of 0, gives you a completely uniform bokeh. Any values in between is it's gonna transition to a 0 fill bokeh. So as you can see, a hollow of 1 makes the bokeh completely hollow, as the name suggests, of course. With this set to 1, the only thing that shows up is the overcorrection of the bokeh, which is the next parameter, and this controls the fall off of the overcorrection. So if you decrease its value, the overcorrection is gonna be less, and the higher values give you more correction. Actually, it's just a fall off. It makes it like a thinner line, actually. And by the way, you probably noticed this already. If I change any of these two parameters here, it's changing the exposure of the image. And that's because if you look at the iris here, it's changing. It doesn't account for the average luminance of the transparency of the iris. So that's why I have this exposure adjust parameter here to correct for that. So if I bring it like correction of 10, I can put it like exposure of 6, I think. And yeah, that just about covers it. Up next is the iris offset. Now this parameter is interesting. First of all, it controls the iris, basically this plane here. This plane is considered as the iris. It controls the distance offset of the iris in respect to the camera. So as you can see, higher values place it further away, lower values makes it right at the camera. Now the distance of the iris to the camera affects two key things. First of all, it affects the cat's eye bokeh distortion, as you can see right here at the corners, and it affects vignette. So if I bring an offset of like 0, gives you virtually no cat's eye bokeh and virtually no vignette. Whereas as you increase this value, the amount of vignette and cat's eye increases until the point where you start to actually see the iris cut out right in the frame. So if I increase this, it changes the size. So basically, this is why cameras have vignette. It's really just an artifact of the lens instead of manufacturers intending to add vignette. And of course, all of this is consistent to whatever parameter, the focal length and the f-stop. So no matter what values you put for the focal length or f-stop, you will get the same amount of vignette and cat's eye. It's all being accounted for. However, one thing about cat's eye bokeh is that almost all the time, the higher your focal length, the less cat's eye you actually get. And if you're rendering animations and you're like animating the focal length to increase for a zoom in shot, then the cat's eye bokeh is gonna stay the same. And you may not want that. So for those of you who want realistic optics physics, as you increase the focal length, the less vignette and cat's eye you get, this is what you need to do. Go to select your iris, go to object properties, and here there's a driver driving the Y location of the iris. And if you click on this, you can see the expression that is being used to drive this value. And to change this, you have to remove a certain part of this expression. And because I know some of y'all may not be able to follow up on this, I have left an expression that you have to copy and paste into these. So there is two expressions. The first one, you copy it into this Y location of the iris. And the second expression, which is a lot longer, you select the camera, go to the camera settings, and the clip start here. You select this and paste it in. I have the expressions right here. Just copy the shorter one and paste it right into the iris here. Boom. Enter. And for the camera, select the longer one, copy, and paste it in here. Whoops, why is it not? Okay. And there we go. And basically everything's still the same, except now when you increase the focal length, increase the f-stop, you can see at 150 millimeters, there's basically no vignette or cat's eye anymore. And as you zoom in further and increase the f-stop so that it doesn't blur out that much. Yeah, as you zoom in further, the less cat's eye there are. However, by doing this, there is a problem where when you bring the focal length all the way to like 29, at some point you're gonna start zooming out into the iris. So this is actually a reason why lenses have specific ranges, because at some point, if you zoom out too much, you're gonna start being able to see the iris cut out. So there is a slight drawback to doing this, but it does give you realistic results. And honestly, I would probably use this in my animations because, you just gotta pull back the iris offset. It's not that difficult. You can animate this, of course. But I thought majority of you would not need this, so yeah. On default, it's left with that expression that compensates for the cat's eye and vignette. Alright, up next, ratio. Now this is really simple. This parameter really is just from the camera setting here. I've just given it a driver so that when you change the ratio, like a 2, you get basically the same thing. Or you can even go the other way, a ratio of 0.5 and stretches the bokeh. However, I do have to mention that if you bring the ratio values too high, at some point it's going to start squeezing in the frame like this and chop off the sides of your render. So to compensate, you will need to bring the iris offset backwards and it will solve it. And that's just because the ratio is like squeezing the iris like this. So at some point it's gonna cut. Alright, moving on, we got bokeh cutoff, and as the name suggests, of course, it cuts off the bokeh. This top parameter, if you bring it all the way to the max value, which is 10, it cuts the top half of the bokeh. Whereas at bottom, when you bring to the max, it cuts the bottom half. And yeah, of course, if you bring it 10, 10 like this, it cuts the entire thing, so you won't be able to see anything. And of course, this will reduce the brightness and exposure, so you will have to use exposure adjust again to compensate for this. And finally, we got aberration. Now, all of these parameters here, Honestly, it makes it makes the whole node group look kind of complicated, but really it's just coordinate parameters for you to offset the iris RGBs. You may have noticed already there is a slight aberration, a slight chromatic aberration for the bokeh. You can see up here is a little yellowish green. Over here is like bluish magenta, and there's a bit of red at the bottom left of each bokeh. So all these letters here just stands for RGB, red, green, and blue, and X, Y, X, Y, X, Y. These are just the coordinate axis. So red X, if I bring this value up, it's gonna move the red channel of this iris towards the positive X values, meaning to the right. And of course, red Y, it moves it upwards because positive Y. Same for the green, left and up, right and up. Blue, right and up. It's just a coordinate values. And for the scale, it's just the individual RGB channels scale values. So it just offsets the scale multiplier. Top one controls the red scale, middle green scale, and blue, of course, simple stuff. It's really not very complicated. And over here, there's a little quality of life node group here. So this thing basically takes your values here and you can multiply it to exaggerate the chromatic aberration here. So really, you can just connect all these values like this. And by default, all these values here are the same as these values. So I can just plug all of that in, you get the same result, and you can now multiply the offset of the RGB channels and really exaggerate the aberration. So if I go back to camera now, a multiplier of 5, now you can see you're getting some really rainbow bokeh now. So for the aberration, unless you really want to get like specific colored chromatic aberration for the bokeh, you may change the offset and scale if you want, if you really know what you're doing. But for me, the default, this is what I would use because I think this produces the most realistic results. And then if you want to exaggerate them, you can use the multiplier, just connect all of that, multiply it by whatever values you want. And yeah, that's all the parameters there. Now it's time for me to address the limitations of this custom bokeh camera setup because nothing's ever perfect, although this is pretty as much as perfect as you can get it to be. Firstly, the iris distance. Now, you may already know this, the iris distance to the camera depends on a lot of parameters. The f-stop, the focal length, iris offset, it's pretty much linked to everything. But the focal length in particular is the main driver for this iris. So you can see if I bring the focal length to like 1,000 millimeters, the iris goes up this far. And in fact, if you come and notice, it actually has overtaken Suzanne here. So what happens now? Now you may notice this camera, the clip start is being driven. It has a driver driving its values. And that's to prevent whatever objects that are in between the camera and the iris from being seen. In particular, I was thinking about fog, like if you have volumetrics in your scene, I thought having a clip start to prevent all that scattering from happening before the light even entered the iris. But that would also mean that whatever's behind your iris, like Suzanne right here, will not be seen because of the clip start. So a solution is to bring the iris offset back to like 0. But even then, there's a bit of offset to compensate for the focal length. And if you crank this up even higher, eventually it's still gonna be a huge distance. But hey, who would ever need a focal length of 2 freaking meters? That's just bonkers. And at this focal length, there's pretty much no way anyone's gonna position their subject like this close to the camera. It's usually for really far subjects, so I wouldn't really worry about this. It is honestly not really a big limitation, but it is something to bear in mind. There's also a limitation that when you bring the focal length too low and have the camera really, really wide, eventually your iris is going to disappear. And at some point, you'll lose your bokeh effect at about like 3.5 millimeters, 3.4, 3.3, 3.2. But if you have your iris offset even lower, like at 0, then this limitation will be even lower. Starts working at 8.3. So yeah, keep that in mind. There's a minimum focal length that you can have before the bokeh would stop working. But honestly, I don't see how anyone would use this custom bokeh at such high focal length. Most of the time, wouldn't really have any depth of field. So yeah, again, not really something to worry about, but it's something to bear in mind. Now, I can probably already tell that some of y'all are asking, well, what about like dust particles and intricate details in the bokeh? Well, for that, you're going to need to use a bokeh map, and I have a separate blend file for you to add your own bokeh maps, so let's get into that right now. So this blend file is called Custom Bokeh Map Rig, and it's essentially the same exact setup The only differences is in the nodes. 2 of the parameters are gone, and there's one new one, which is called rotation. Now, first of all, if you go ahead and start rendering with this, you will see it looks a little weird. It's like cut off at the corners like this. And that's because, and also the bokeh is completely uniform. It's not how you would expect. And that's because it's waiting for you to add your own bokeh map. So what you need to do is hit this button right here to go into the node group, or hit tab. And now you zoom all the way out and look in the middle. There's this spot over here which has a frame called add your bokeh map here. And obviously you know what to do. Just open your file, go to your like bokeh maps. I have one in my documents, media, bokeh maps, and let's choose this one for example. You gotta add the same thing for the 2 other image texture nodes as well, and you can click it right here and click your bokeh map, which you've already added into your project file. You can just add it through this button here. And now it is completely set up. That's how it looks like, and it's ready to be used. Now let me demonstrate what this rotation thing is. Basically, it's just rotating the bokeh map. So yeah, I guess for a circular thing like this with tiny details isn't gonna show up well. Let me try something else. Let's try a star. Now, there's one thing I gotta mention here. When you're trying different types of shapes that are asymmetrical, that's not a perfect circle, you gotta keep in mind that the texture that you're putting in is only gonna show up at a cutout that's a circle like this here. Whatever that's in the corners of your texture file that is not enclosed in a circle that fits perfectly in the square texture itself will not be shown. So let me show you with this star. As you can see, for the most part, it does fit. It does look like a perfect circle like this will include most of the star, but right here in these 2 corners, it looks like it might not. So let's choose this and select the same thing for the other ones. And also I can see I have to bring my iris offset to 0, otherwise the cat's eye effect cuts out the texture. And let's get rid of Zuzane right now because I want to focus on the bokeh. And alright, it had cut out the little tip of these 2 parts. So yeah, just keep that in mind. I have a separate file that has the stars slightly shrinked. And if I use this one, star 2, it is perfect now. Nothing gets cut off. And star bokeh. You can literally have whatever shaped bokeh what you want. Very simple to use, and yeah. And I somehow forgot to mention this in the recording, but the rotation just rotates the bokeh map. Duh. In degrees, by the way. There's something to keep in mind. Oops. One last thing I've not talked about yet is importing this thing into your project file, which is really simple, honestly. Here I have a pretty normal scene right here with me as a subject in a beautiful birch biome. If you already got a camera in your project file, like let's say if I create a camera like right now, and let's say I've already positioned it where I wanted it to be, like this, go into your camera view, just click on your middle mouse button and delete it. And now what you have to do is go File, Append, and find the project file which you have your custom bokeh rig saved, and just open that, find collection, and append me. Append the collection that says append me, and boom, there you go. Now you have your camera. Now just select your camera, go to your timeline and hit Control B. That will create a marker. You can delete that, and that's an active camera now. And now hit Shift V, and that will snap it right at your view. Basically, this camera is at the exact same position and framing that the previous camera had. And just like that, you now have the superior camera setup that will make your renders a billion times better. Yeah, first things first, just set your distance. Usually it's a really zoomed in, about right here like that. It's like a good focus distance. And now we can go to render to see how this looks like. Usually the f-stop isn't high enough, so I would bring it to like 0.5. Doesn't look quite bright enough, so I'm gonna go to the iris, go to the materials, and exposure, bring like 1 stop higher. Looks great now. And every time when I have a new camera in the scene, I would tinker with the iris offset to get a vignette I would like. That's the most important thing I would care about first. Just change the hollow and correction fall off, or just put your own bokeh map into the image texture files, and you're good to go. And yeah, if you find that it's rendering too slow, because custom bokeh, to render out the bokeh details, you need to render at quite a high sample count. So use the noise threshold, put it like 0.2 or 0.3, and have a minimum samples at which there is decent detail already rendered in the bokeh, and then set a maximum samples of like 5,000 or something. And by the time it samples to that value, you should have a perfect result. So yeah, that's really all there is to my custom bokeh camera setup. Hope you make wonders with it, and thanks for watching, and thanks for downloading, and thanks for entering my Discord server.